What is popular culture? Before we consider in detail the different ways in which popular culture has been both defined and analyzed, I want to outline some of the general features of the debate that the study of popular culture has generated. It is not my intention to preempt the specific findings and arguments that will be presented in the following chapters. Here, I simply wish to map out the general conceptual landscape of popular culture. This is, in many ways, a daunting task. As Tony Bennett points out, as it stands, the concept of popular culture is virtually useless, a melting pot of confused and contradictory meanings capable of misdirecting inquiry up any number of theoretical blind alleys. Part of the difficulty stems from the implied otherness that is always absent or present when we use the term popular culture. As we shall see in the chapters which follow, popular culture is always defined implicitly or explicitly in contrast to other conceptual categories. Folk culture, mass culture, dominant culture, working class culture, etc. A full definition must always take this into account. Moreover, as we shall also see, whichever conceptual category is deployed as popular culture's absent other, it will always powerfully affect connotations brought into play when we use the term popular culture. Therefore, to study popular culture, we must first confront the difficulty posed by the term itself. That is, depending on how it is used, quite different areas of inquiry and forms of theoretical definition and analytical focus are suggested. The main argument that I suspect readers will take from this book is that popular culture is, in fact, an empty conceptual category, one that can be filled in a wide variety of often conflicting ways, depending on the context of use. In order to define popular culture, we first need to define the term culture. And Raymond Williams calls culture one of the two or three most complicated words in the English language. Williams suggests three broad definitions. First, culture can be used to refer to a general process of intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic development. We would, for example, speak about the cultural development of Western Europe can be referring only to intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic factors. Great philosophers, great artists, and great poets. This would be perfectly understandable formulation. A second use, let me put that. Second use of the word culture might be to suggest a particular way of life, whether of a people, a period, or a group. Using this definition, if we speak of the cultural development of Western Europe, we would have in mind not just intellectual and aesthetic factors, but the development of, for example, literacy, holidays, sport, religious festivals. Okay. And finally, Williams suggests that culture can be used to refer to the works and practices of intellectual and especially artistic activity. In other words, culture here means the texts and practices whose principal function is to signify, to produce, or to be the occasion for the production of meaning. Culture in this third definition is synonymous with what structuralists and post structuralists call signifying practices. Using this definition, we would probably think of examples such as poetry, the novel, ballet, opera, and fine art. To speak of popular culture usually means to mobilize the second and third meanings of the word culture. The second meaning, culture as a particular way of life, would allow us to speak of such practices as the seaside holiday, the celebration of Christmas, the youth subcultures as examples of culture. These are usually referred to as lived cultures or practices. The third meaning, culture as signifying practices, will allow us to speak of soap opera, pop music, and comics as examples of culture. These are usually referred to as texts. Few people would imagine Williams' first definition when thinking about popular culture. All right, now ideology. Before we turn to the different definitions of popular culture, there is another term we have to think about: ideology. Ideology is a crucial concept in the study of popular culture. Graham Turner calls it the most important conceptual category in cultural studies. James Carey has even suggested that British cultural studies could be described just as easily and perhaps more accurately as ideological studies. Like culture, ideology has many competing meanings. As understanding of this concept is often complicated by the fact that in much cultural analysis, the concept is used interchangeably with culture itself, and especially popular culture. The fact that ideology has been used to refer to the same conceptual terrain as culture and popular culture makes it an important term in any understanding of the nature of popular culture. What follows is a brief discussion of just 5 of the many ways of understanding ideology. We will consider only those meanings that have a bearing on the study of popular culture. If somebody was in here, I'd say, do you get this? First, ideology can refer to a systematic body of ideas. Okay, so, well, obviously, ideology is something to do with ideas, duh, articulated by a particular group of people. For example, we could speak of professional ideology to refer to the ideas which inform the practices of particular professional groups. We could also speak of the ideology of the Labor Party. Here we would be referring to the collection of political, economic, and social ideas that inform aspirations and activities of the party. A second definition suggests a certain masking, distortion, or concealment ideology. No, ideology is used here to indicate how some texts and practices present distorted images of reality. They produce what is sometimes called false consciousness. Such distortions, it is argued, work in the interest of the powerful against the interest of the powerless. Oh, that sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? Okay. Using this definition, we might speak of capitalist ideology. I got this going in another class. It's like all my classes are going kind of sort of like that. I don't get it. Um, it almost seems like I'm taking the same class. Like I've got four classes. One is pretty much theory. One is culture. This one is spatiality, and the other one is American literature. So there's American literature, spatiality is under literature, and the culture and the theory are under English. But I'm hearing some of the same stuff, the same authors, um, the same old people, like who are dead. Okay, just saying. All right, so here we go. What would be what would be intimidated by this usage would be the way in which ideology conceals the reality of domination from those in power. The dominant class did not see themselves as exploiters or oppressors. And perhaps more importantly, the way in which ideology conceals the reality of subordination from those who are powerless. The subordinate classes do not see themselves as oppressed or exploited. This definition derives from certain assumptions about the circumstances of the production of texts and practices. It is argued that they are the superstructural reflections or expressions, that sounds important, of the popular or of the power relations of the economic base of society. This is one of the fundamental assumptions of classical Marxism. Here is Karl Marx's famous formulation. Well, if it's famous, I guess it's definitely going to be important. I'll just put a line that goes kind of like down there. All right. By the way, if you're like watching this later and you have anything you might want to help me with, that would be nice. Okay. So, Karl Marx. In the social production of their existence, men enter into definite necessary relations which are independent of their will, namely, relations of production corresponding to a determinate stage God of development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which there arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which there correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. Oh God, this is going to kill me. This is cultural theory and popular culture, an introduction, fifth edition. Okay. So now we're going to explain it. What Marx is suggesting is that the way a society organizes the means of its economic production will have a determining effect on the type of culture that society produces or makes possible. The cultural products of this so called base superstructure relationship are deemed ideological to the extent that, as a result of this relationship, they're implicitly or explicitly, they implicitly or explicitly support the interests, hold on, of dominant groups who socially, politically, economically, and culturally benefit from this particular economic organization of society. See, you know what I don't get? Where right now it's going to say, in chapter 4, we will consider blah, blah, blah. Why are they going to tell me what's going to happen in chapter 4? I am on chapter 1. All right. In chapter 4, we will consider the modifications made by Marx and Frederick Engels themselves to this formulation and the way in which subsequent Marxists have further modified what has come to be regarded by many cultural critics as a rather mechanistic count of what we might call the social relations of culture and popular culture. However, having said this, it is nevertheless the case that acceptance of the contention, the flow of casual traffic within society is unequally structured, such that the economy, in a privileged way, influences political and ideological relationships in ways that are not true. In reverse, has usually been held to constitute a limit position for Marxism. Abandon this claim, it is argued, and Marxism ceases to be Marxism. That's from Bennett. Okay, we can also use ideology in this general sense to refer to power relations outside those of class. For instance, feminists speak of the power of patriarchal ideology. So use something else. Feminists speak of whatever the fuck they want to speak of. Okay, that sounded like an old lady too, didn't it? All right. Um, and how it operates to conceal, mask, and distort gender relations in our society. In chapter 8, oh, now they're going to tell us what they're going to do in chapter 8. We will examine the ideology of racism. A third definition of ideology, closely related to and in some ways dependent on the second definition, uses the term to refer to ideological forms. It's Marx. This usage is intended to draw attention to the way in which text, television, television fiction, pop songs, novels, feature films, etc., always present a particular image of the world. This definition depends on a notion of society as a conflictual rather than consensual, structured around equality, exploitation, and oppression. Texts are said to take sides, consciously or unconsciously, in this conflict. That's interesting. The German playwright Bertolt Brecht summarizes the point. Good or bad, a play always includes an image of the world. There is no play and no theatrical performance which does not in some way affect the dispositions and conceptions of the audience. Art is never without consequences. Oh, interesting. That point can be generalized to apply to all texts. Another way of saying this would be simply to argue that all texts are ultimately political. That is, they offer competing ideological significations of the way the world is or should be. Popular culture is thus, as Hall claims, a site where collective social understandings are created, a terrain on which the politics of, politics of signification are played out in attempts to win people to particular ways of seeing. What are people to come in here? Come in, come in. There's another one. There's a fourth definition of idea. Oh, that's right. There were five of them. Um, so a fourth definition is one associated with the early work of the French cultural theorist Roland Barthes. Discussed more in chapter 6. Barthes argues that ideology or myth, as Barthes himself calls it, operates mainly at the level of connotations, the secondary, often unconscious meanings that texts and practices carry or can be made to carry. For example, a conservative party political broadcast transmitted in 1990 ended with the word socialism being transported into red prison bars. What was being suggested is that the socialism of the Labor Party is synonymous with social, economic, and political imprisonment. The broadcast was attempting to fix the connotations of the word socialism. Moreover, it hoped to locate socialism in a binary relationship in which it connoted unfreedom whilst conservatism connoted that word freedom. Okay, so for Barth, this would be a classic example of the operations of ideology, the attempt to make universal and legitimate what is in fact partial and particular, an attempt to pass off that which is cultural, meaning humanly made. Oh, as something which is natural, just existing. Aha. Similarly, it could be argued that in British society, white, masculine, heterosexual, middle class are unmarked in the sense that they are the normal, the natural, the universal, from which other ways of being are an inferior variation on an original. This is made clear in such formulations as a female pop singer, a Black journalist, a working class writer, a gay comedian. In each instance, the first term is used oh, to qualify the second as a deviation from the universal categories of pop singer, journalist, writer, and comedian. This is some good shit. How are you people? I've been here for 25 minutes. Mhm. A fifth definition is one that was very influential in the 1970s and early 80s. It is the definition of ideology developed by the French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser. We shall discuss Althusser in more detail in chapter 4, of course. Here I will simply outline some key points about one of his definitions of ideology. Althusser's main contention is to see ideology not simply as a body of ideas, but as a material practice. What he means by this is that ideology is encountered in the practices of everyday life and not simply in ideas about everyday life. Principally, what Althusser has in mind is the way in which certain rituals and customs have the effect of binding us to the social order that is marked by enormous inequalities of wealth, status, and power. Using this definition, we could describe the seaside holiday or the celebration of Christmas as examples of ideological practices. This would point to the way in which they offer pleasure and release from the usual demands of social order, but that ultimately they return us to our places in the social order, refreshed and ready to tolerate our exploitation and oppression until the next official break comes along. In this sense, ideology works to reproduce the social conditions and social relations necessary for the economic conditions and economic relations of capitalism to continue. So far, we have briefly examined different ways of defining culture and ideology. What should be clear by now is that culture and ideology do cover much the same conceptual landscape. The main difference between them is that ideology brings a political dimension to the shared domain. In addition, the introduction of the concept of ideology suggests that relations of power and politics inescapably mark the culture ideology landscape. It suggests that the power, that the study of popular culture amounts to something more than a simple discussion of entertainment and leisure. I want to say, what do y'all think of that? But nobody's here. This is good for a couple of subs. Likes. All right. All the time. Hmm. Man, y'all should be reading this to me. I don't want to read this one anymore. What should I do? All right, I know what I'm. Where now? It's not even here. All these things that I downloaded. Let's see. Well, maybe I can read. Let me see if this has. Um, let me see. Let me see. Let me see. Yeah, let me see. Whisper choice on. Let it be. Okay, let me see. That's the syllabus. That's the introduction. Um, one under files. Join module. Because I might be able to get this. It's a PDF. Or at least be more interesting. Nobody. 30 minutes, nobody. It's all right. Even y'all. I don't know if anybody's still here. If anybody is watching, right? Where the hell? It's like all of them have it except this one that I have to read. This is assignments, but let's see. Well, it might be under syllabus. Let's see. Let me see. No, no, he just doesn't have it. All right, so one thing I guess you're going to be listening to if you're here is spatiality. I really didn't want to have to do this. Oh, I didn't know this was mirrored. Oh, well, that's YouTube for you. I wonder if I can undo that. Well, then it will probably just confuse me. All right. So we're actually on chapter 2. So, and I had already started it. So, no, I didn't. Shit. I kind of sort of did. I skipped over a lot of stuff. In the opening lines of the chart, okay, I'm old, I'm tired. In the opening lines of the chart, a chapter which the narrator asserts so far as what there may be of a narrative in this book is as important as one will be found in Moby Dick. Herman Melville dramatizes the literary cartographic project of that novel. So this chapter is called Literary Cartography. Because and you, I'm probably usually not this bad. I have 4.0, but it's hard. It's really, really hard for me. And this particular semester's like really theory and heavy, and as you can hear, the fun stuff is with the poetry. I got to admit. Had you followed Captain Ahab down into his cabin after the squall that took place on the night succeeding the wild ratification of his purpose with the crew, you would have seen him go to the locker in the transom and bringing out a large, wrinkled roll of yellow sea charts, spread them before him on his screwed down table. Then, seating himself before it, you would have seen him intently study the various lines and shadings which there met his eye, and with slow but steady pencil trace additional lines over spaces that before were blank. While thus employed, the heavy pewter lamp suspended in chains over his head continually rocked with the motion of the ship, and forever threw shifting gleams and shadows of lines upon his wrinkled brow. It almost seemed that while he himself was marking out lines and courses on the wrinkled charts, some invisible pencil also tracing lines and courses upon the deeply marked chart of his forehead. It was Melville. Here, Melville depicts Ahab literally poring over his maps, tracing out trajectories, registering the old knowledge, and projecting new directions for inquiry. In the context of Ahab's hunt for the white whale, the scene serves as an important narrative function. That is, to explain to the reader just how one experienced fisherman, using detailed geographical and historical knowledge, could indeed locate a single whale in so vast a space as the world's oceans. But just as Ahab uses his pencil to fill in spaces that before were blank, the shifting gleams and shadows of lines mark the blank spaces of Ahab himself, who, in a much more figurative sense, represents a territory to be explored, to be mapped, to be known. At this moment in the novel, the immense magnitude of the world system and the enigma of the tragic hero coincide in an explicitly cartographic image. In order to make sense of this world at both the macroscopic level of the, oh boy, terraqueous globe and the microscopic level of the individual subject, Melville employs a literary technique and it itself fundamentally and is itself fundamentally a form of mapping. In examining both the real places of the geographical globe and the imaginary places of his own fictional universe, Melville's literary cartography discloses the real and imagined spaces of the world, as Edward Soja has called them. The act of writing itself might be considered a form of mapping or a cartographic activity. Like the map maker, the writer must survey territory, determining which features of a given landscape to include, to emphasize, or to diminish. For example, some shadings may need to be darker than others, some lines bolder, and so on. The writer must establish the scale and the shape, no less of the narrative than of the places in it. The literary cartographer, even one who operates in such non realistic modes as myth or fantasy, must determine the degree to which a given representation of a place refers to any real place in the geographical world. In this chapter, I will discuss the ways in which writers function as map makers, and I will point to certain aspects of the theory of literature as literary cartography. Get that shit. Not me neither. Okay. First, I will look at the general notion of literary cartography, whereby the creative writer or the writer of narrative engages in an activity quite similar to map making. It is true that this is metaphorical, as the map becomes a figure for the linguistic and imaginative activity of writing. But it is also true that there are narrative maps. That is to say, a map is not only a geometrical figure, like a grid, a visual archive, like a table, or even a work of graphic art, like a painting. A map may also constitute itself in words. There is an almost simultaneous figurative and literal aspect of literary cartography. And the writer engaged in such a project need not always be self consciously mapping. Sometimes the very act of telling a story is also a process of producing a map. And this operates in both directions. Of course, storytelling involves mapping, but a map also tells a story. And the interrelations between space and writing tend to generate new places and new narratives. As Peter Turkis has put it in Maps of the Imagination, the writer as cartographer, to ask for a map is to say, tell me a story. After my initial and general discussion of literary cartography, I will explore the theory of the writer as map maker through various theories of narrative, including a discussion of genre and especially Russian critic Mikhail Bakhtin's influential concept of conotope, a time space represented and organized by the novelist genre's Bakhtin analysis. I'm sorry, analyzes. Then, by looking briefly at philologist Eric Auerbach's influential argument concerning the representation of reality in Western literature, as his monumental 1946 study, Mimesis, is subtitled, I argue that the relationship between the individual author and the world that the literary work purports to represent is fundamentally spatial, as well as temporal or historical, and that the distinction among various modes of literary representation is closely tied to the different ways of seeing and representing these real and imagined spaces. The Hungarian literary theorist George Lukács, in his delineation of the distinctions between epic and novel forms, draws attention to the relationship between narrative and mapping in intriguing ways. All three of these influential critics understand literary forms or genres as approaches to understanding the world, that is, of making sense of or giving form to the world. For each theorist, narrative form is thus tried to a cartographic project. Then, discussing the characterization of the ancient world whose dominant narrative form is the epic, I will argue alongside these other critics that the advent of modernity, as discussed in chapter 1, with the rise of linear perspective, of abstract or mathematical space, and of the capitalist mode of production, called for new ways of mapping such spaces in literature. Not surprisingly, the new form of literary cartography is the modern novel itself. In Lukács' view, for example, the novel is a response to a condition of transcendental homelessness in which the individual or collective subject must now create a cosmos in order to make his own existence intelligible and meaningful. Really next to transcendental homelessness. All right. Lukács' conception of transcendental homelessness is suggestive of the existential condition later described by 20th century philosophers Martin Heidegger. I know we're going to get that later. and Jean-Paul Sartre. In Heidegger's view, the experience of being in the world is occasioned by the intense anxiety and the sense of the uncanny, which Sigmund Freud had also analyzed. Y'all are missing something good here. Just saying. All right. The word uncanny in German, unheimlich, some kind of maneuver, actually suggests an unhomeliness. And Heidegger writes that the feeling of anxiety, or in German, Angst, is fundamentally a sense of not being at home in the world. In part, the existentialist philosophy of Sartre derives from his understanding of Heidegger's notion of being in the world. But unlike Sartre does not seek to restore mankind to some sort of primordial, more holistic sense of place. Rather, Sartre's theory, while acknowledging the real anguish that accompanies a person's sense of being lost, demands that individuals develop projects by which to give our lives meaning, or to put it in a vernacular more suited to space and spatial relations, to reestablish our sense of place in the world. It makes sense. The crucial element in the formation of such projects is the faculty of the imagination itself, which makes Sartre's philosophy rather suggestive of literary cartography as well. Finally, I will examine Frederick Jameson's influential conception of cognitive mapping, which partly derives in meaningful ways from these other literary critics and philosophers. Jameson's notion offers a model of literary cartography which moves beyond the existentialist project and becomes a means by which a writer can supersede the individual's sense of place or placelessness by projecting a supra-individual image of the world system itself. With an aesthetic of cognitive mapping, Jameson arrives at a conception for understanding the world and our place in the world. But he also provides a tool by which the world may be changed or other worlds imagined. Indeed, a sort of cognitive mapping undergirds the project of literary representation itself, whether conceived in terms of allegory or limited to supposedly realistic writing. The writer who sets out to map the world, to trace lines and shadows upon the blank spaces of the page, also makes possible other worlds. In this meticulous and thorough reading of Herodotus' histories, the ancient Greek text written in the 5th century BCE and widely considered the first work of history in Western civilization, the French historian Francois Hartog has observed that narrative is the result of both the geographical project of the surveyor and the work of a rhapsode, a term used in its technical or etymological sense of a weaver, as one who thus weaves disparate parts into a whole. For Hartog, that the narrator of these texts becomes by turns, but also simultaneously a surveyor of spaces, a rhapsode who sews these spaces into a new unity, and a bard who ultimately invents the world so surveyed and stitched together, referring to how referring to the oikoumene, the ancient Greek word for world. Hartog writes, the narrator is thus the surveyor, and in a number of sentences a rhapsode, but he is also a bard in that the inventory of the oikoumene cannot fail to be an invention of the world, if only by reason of the use of the space of language. For correlations exist between the order of the discourse and the order of the world. As Herodotus produced his inventory of distant peoples and border territories, did he not invent the oikoumene and set the human world in order? The space of the narrative purports to be a representation of the world, and he, the rhapsode, is the one who, Idias Seminai, who indicates the forms, who makes things happen, who reveals. He is the one who knows. It's hard to narrative. You know what? Yeah, I know. I'm doing it again. Now let's just hope I got enough of it, right? Because I'm going to take the quiz. I don't know where all you people are. If you watched up to now by some miracle, please subscribe. Please hit like. This is rough. We did go back to school at the age of 54. By back to school, I'm talking about setting foot on a college campus for the first time ever. And whatever, 54 minus 18, no, 17. You know, that's how many years it had been since I had been inside of school. I don't know, this one isn't so bad, right? I wonder if it's going to be visible to y'all. Anyway, um, I hope somebody views it and shows me some love. And I love you guys. Here's to learning.